Hello, guys. Welcome to Literary Tea. I'm Anna,
I'm Jorge, and we'll be your host in this podcast, in which we talk about literature together with other themes.
and today's episode is called How Can Literature Shape Our Character? To answer this guiding question, of course, we have to pass through our personal literary experiences, right? So, Jorge, what kind of books and stories would you read as a child?
Well, and basically, I would read comics and fairy tales. And when I was a very little child, my father and my sister they would read me adapted Bible story for kids. But that's it. And when I started to grow up, and when I could read by myself, I would read basically more fairy tales and comics.
So I have to agree with you. I mean, my childhood was basically ruled by fairy tales, and I had like many books here from different illustrations and versions of the fairy tales, the famous ones. And I remember my mom and dad reading to me before I sleep, and it was very funny to me.
Actually, I remember that. Well, I was mostly scared of the fairy tales. Instead of finding them funny, I would find them mostly scary. Because, well, especially one that I think up to nowadays is my favorite one. It is called Rumpelstiltskin. I think it's my favorite one until today. But at the time, I would love listening to this fairy tale, and at the same time, I would find it very, very scary.
And there is a thing about old books of fairy tales that the illustrations they were not that much family friendly, if you know what I mean.
Uh huh. Yeah.
Some of them were really scaring. I was afraid too of some, especially the witches. They were like with big eyes and big noses, and the children in the illustrations were always scared of everything.
I think that uh, kids, when they grow up by reading fairy tales or listening to fairy tales, especially when they have the opportunity to see like illustrations like those you were mentioning, you know, kids are normally kind of scared. So it just helps them to get more scared. I don't see actually why people do such illustrations. They illustrate works like that when the target people that are going to consume the tales are kids.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I don't know also. I just know that yes, we can be traumatized by those pictures. Until today I have some of these books, and when I look at the illustrations, even now that I'm more than 20 years old, I still get a little bit scared of some of them.
But even though I love fairy tales so much, I think it was a very important part of my literary identity that I think, yeah, 2 years ago I bought a collection of fairy tales. It is a three-book collection, and well, uh, uh, the site from where I bought it uh, describes it as as it being the original one, like the source text translated to Portuguese.
Really? That's awesome. So is it a bilingual edition?
No, unfortunately, it isn't.
It's Oh, I see. It's just the translation, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
but yeah, basically, I read most of the stories that I with which I had contact as a kid were fairy tales. I think that was it. Apart from the comics, only fairy tales.
yeah. I used to read them with such very quickly and with such an eager of finishing it and living the adventure. especially was amazing.
The sagas, you mean?
The saga, the one that marked my like the end of the childhood was one saga called Del Toro Quest, written by Emily Rhoda. I think she's an Australian writer, and this saga has like three parts. You know, I don't know if I can say season. They have like three parts, and I still have all of them until today. And they were like, I mean, you know that those movies that you watch the first one and you have the sequence,
Yeah,
and the sequence is not always as good as the first one.
yeah.
So this um, trilogy of series, if I may say, all of them are interesting. All of them. I like all. The first
Oh,
part, the second, and the third.
okay. Is it a trilogy?
A trilogy of series because the first part you have 8 books. The second part is another context, another adventure. You have 3 books, and the third one you have 4 books, another adventure, another context, and so on.
Uh, well, I think that I I didn't used to read many sagas, but in the end of my childhood, I read a Brazilian one. In Portuguese, the title is Filhos do Éden. In English, it would be Eden's Sons, and it is by a Brazilian writer. And yeah, it also has 3 books. It is also a trilogy, and I still have the books. I still have the books, and there is one book which is out of the context of the saga, which would be a fourth book, but actually it's better than the 3 previous ones. But anyway, I didn't read much sagas. Only this one, I think, at the end of the childhood, because I would start reading sagas when I was a teenager.
So you're talking about the another phase of our lives, right? The adolescence.
Yeah, yeah.
This saga kind of mark a transition of phase, right?
When I was like an adolescent, I think that yeah, I would read mostly sagas, but I think only in the beginning of my early teens, because then I would change from narrative to other genres. But yeah, and I think that at the time, as from a great quantity of people as well, Harry Potter marked me so much. Even though I read Harry Potter when I was already 16, but the story, from the movies, I mean, I would consume a lot, and it marked me a lot because there is some fantasy also in Harry Potter, and you know, as a kid, I would read mostly fairy tales, and then when I would get to my adolescence, I enjoyed a lot of Harry Potter. But even though I would also read the sagas that had basically vampires, werewolves, fairies, mermaids, this kind of thing, which
Yeah.
are somehow fantastical,
Yes. Fantastic creatures, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, this saga that I mentioned, it has these elements of these fantastic elements, right? Actually, and um, I think we can call our childhood. We have so much in common. I think a good expression to say about our childhood would be like a dreaming phase, right?
yeah, I totally agree.
The dreaming, like, because fantasy, it's all about this, about imagination and dreams in a sense that it's another world that you live in, right?
Yeah,
And other creatures, sometimes even other languages, like Tolkien did. And yeah, I would say it's a dreamy phase, of course.
Okay, yeah, I agree with it. But even though I think for me, this dreamy phase, this dreamy part of my life, it continued on to adolescence, even though it changed. Actually, it changed when I was like 14 to 16.
Yeah.
Then I would start reading poetry, for example. Uh, how did you change your reading? When you left somehow fantasy.
Why poetry? What called your attention? What attracted you in poetry for you to read it so much?
Okay, let's say I think I started reading poetry when I was 14, and at this time, I think everyone at this age, almost everyone, is a little bit turbulent, you know.
Yes.
so, so all the puberty and all that thing, hormones. Anyway, so I would start reading poetry, especially influenced by the school. I would read lots of romantic poems because I felt that it somehow translated what I was feeling at the time. So for me, there was a lot of it, of identifying with the poet. And yeah, that was it. I think that's the reason why I would read mostly poems at this time of my life.
And which poet was like the one that you most identified with?
Okay, I had two. Uh, the first one was Augusto dos Anjos. It is a Brazilian poet, and I still like him up to nowadays. I I was given a Augusto dos Anjos book when I was 14, and I still have it. I, I, I read it a lot nowadays. And the second poet was Álvares de Azevedo, which is a romantic poet here in Brazil.
As Augusto dos Anjos, also, right?
Yeah.
So, what if both of them are poets from the romantic movement in Brazil? Why exactly it called your attention? I mean, about the characteristics of their writing, of the movement itself.
Okay. First, uh, they are different. Okay, in their style. Álvaro de Azevedo is from Romanticism. He's from that phase that we call here Byronian. So he's somehow Byronic in the sense that he writes love poems and poems about a girl that he can never touch, he can never achieve, he can never find. He just dreams of her.
The muse.
And yeah, and also yeah, the contents of his poems are basically this. Augusto, Augusto dos Anjos, he talks a lot about the self in contact with the world, and how he sees also uh, the materialism of our body, of our being, that we are nothing. And at that time, I was somehow a depressive adolescent, a teenager, and I would identify with this kind of poems with Álvares de Azevedo, because at the time I would fall in love with some people, and I found refuge, if I can say it like this, in his love poems. And Augusto translated to me the darkest sides of myself at the time. So
Oh,
that's why I identified with them.
oh, the darkest side of yourself. Okay.
Darkest at 14.
At 14, because your self was built at 14.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, I used to read poetry as a teenager, especially because of the literature classes at school. But I have to confess that literature was mostly, the teacher showed a poem in class and I loved it. And that's it. I was not like a reader of poems, to
I see.
sit in the afternoon and read poems and poems. And I'm not that kind of person, but I enjoy poems.
Did you used to read literature that you saw that you studied in school, or you would go for other genres or other themes?
Some of the books that the schools chooses, they are not sometimes so attractive to teenagers. It's like you read, I don't know, it's like you read Beowulf at 13 years old. It's not that
Okay,
attractive.
yeah.
It's not that attractive. Um, you will read feeling obligated, and sometimes it can interfere in the process of enjoying the work. So some of the books in my adolescence were different from fantasy, if you consider the childhood. And the ones that I liked most and that I was presented at school was a Brazilian author called Ligia Fagundes Teles, and we read when I was like a pre-high school level, and we read some short stories of her, and she had many writing styles, but these short stories in this book, they were specifically like about the mind, like an
Okay.
analysis of the character's mind, what was happening in the character's mind, and not only this, but also in strange situations. And she's not like a horror writer or a thriller writer. It's just because actually she writes about this uneasiness that you feel in some situations and how you come across at those moments actually. And I found that really interesting because it was the first time I read something like that.
Okay, I see it. But let's say that at the time you were quite young, right?
Yeah.
So, what do you think that uh, made you enjoy this kind of reading at such like young age?
I don't know. It's a strange question because I only know that delighted me. Not only Ligia, but also when I was 16, I read for the first time The Unbearable Lightness of Being from Milan Kundera.
Good Lord.
And I was like, I didn't even know what nihilism was, but I was like, oh my God, I can relate to this story. A teenager. I can relate with this story. And I just fell in love with this way of telling stories, focusing on what's happening on the character's mind. And not only these, but also Clarice Lispector and a German author called Patrick Susskind. I don't know how to say the last name, but it's the writer of the book Perfume, which became a movie last decade. Perfume, a story of a murderer. And
Okay,
you,
I've heard about it.
yeah, you should read it. It's amazing. I mean, those kind of stories that almost don't have dialogues, you only live for what's happening on the character's mind. and not only like a narrative of the situation itself, but also a narrative of who that person is, you know? Why
Yeah.
does that character thinks that way and not another one?
So from what I can see, at this time of our life, we would read, stories, basically, for the feeling, that you can relate to it. We wouldn't think a lot about the meaning of the story or what is behind.
Yeah. Yes. It's like almost like an instinctive reading, right?
Yeah, okay.
It's like I read it because I feel attracted to it.
I think the same I can apply to the poems I would read, especially when we see poems as something to read and to feel more than to analyze. Even though we analyze poems, but I would only analyze them, I think, when I got to university. Up to then, I would only read them just to feel, and that's it.
And also, um, I think one another reason is that when we are when we are teenagers, we feel like so represented when we read something that it's like expresses exactly what I think but cannot say in words, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I get it.
We feel so like, oh my god, this book is perfect because this author has the ability to say exactly what I felt my whole life but could never write it down in words, you know?
Yeah, it's something much more introspective.
Yes, individual, it as the word it is, you know? It's for me only. It interests only for me.
Yeah, coming from someone who read The Unbearable Lightness of Being at the age of 16, I would say that it is introspective and individual.
It's all of that and more because that's when I started looking for the meaning of nihilism that is very um, frequent in this author's works, you know? He is like a
Uh huh.
very nihilist guy, and I didn't know at all what that meant, but I totally identify myself with that.
So ahead of the time. I love it.
Um, I guess we could call this like an introspective phase, you know?
Yeah, sure.
Almost not in the sense that we were learning about ourselves at that time because of the introspective, but we would like to feel, to discover our feelings, right? Something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's what changed when when I when I got to university, because there I would have to read many different books that I were not used to, and even though I still would think about the feeling of read something, I would have to analyze it, and things would change almost completely.
Yeah, my experiences at the university were also very um, wide, you know. We did the same course, we know it. We have to read many things that are different among them. And some of them I discovered that I liked, and some of them I discovered that I'm not so into it. What
For example,
um let me see. Like poetry, for example.
okay,
I I I had I attended to some courses that the professor would bring most of the times um, poems from like one and only poet, like Emily Dickinson, for example.
Yeah, I get it. From my experience, I would say that I'm not really into a lot of poetry in English. You know, I think I can grasp the meanings much more reading poetry in Portuguese.
For me, what it was the contrary.
Uh huh.
I told about Emily Dickinson because her way of writing poems, it's not attractive to me, since I think that poetry, it's much more about the emotions, the lyrism that we study. Reading poetry, it's pretty much about this, about feeling, and if it cannot um, light on my feelings, I almost immediately don't identify with that poet. And that happened with Emily Dickinson. But when we studied Walt Whitman, for example, I totally identified myself with him. And I think it's especially because of his way of writing, that it's not so tradition, that it's not so traditional actually.
Yeah. Okay. I haven't read much of Walt Whitman up to now, but a few poems that I read, I was able to like understand something of it much more than Emily Dickinson. But I think that what I could expand in terms of new genres at the university. I think it was the novels, like longer novels that I wasn't able to read. I wouldn't find it attractive to read as a teenager. When we are teenagers, we have to read classics. The school somehow
Yes.
puts up to us a list of classical works, and most of the Brazilian classics in novels, when we are teenagers, they are completely unattractive. So I
Especially
didn't
because of the
I didn't find
language.
it interesting. But when I got to university, I I could like read the novels and think about the themes that underlie them. Then I would enjoy much more. That's why I think that the one of the subjects that I loved so much to study was Victorian Lit.
Why Victorian lit and not another one?
Well, do you know that I still keep asking me the same questions until now? Why I used to find the Victorian Lit more attractive? Well, I think that the context in which the works were written is so rich, and actually the Victorian period is quite long. So uh, nowadays, I think that my favorite period is the late Victorian period. That you have works like Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and
Yes.
so on, because
Yes.
they somehow, uh, you know, talk about this decaying of the Victorian values in the end of the century. So I find them very interesting, as well as the works produced in the beginning of this period, which are much more romantic.
Um yeah, I think it's important also to say here that we actually started reading in English when we started our major, right?
Yeah, completely for me.
And I mean, it was like two new experiences, reading in English itself and reading classics in English, right?
I struggled a lot in the beginning.
Me too. In this time, I remember that my first personal challenge was to read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and I was so proud of myself to make a joke with the title of the book. I was so proud of myself that I could read it and understand it actually and make a review about it. I was so impressed. In the beginning, I was very afraid of not understanding things because I like the story but have never read in English. And when I read and I felt like this is not a monster, I can read that in English. I may have some struggles, but it's not that impossible, you know?
I think that the first classical that I read in English and I was able to read and understand, was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And then yeah, I read them almost simultaneously, and I was so happy that I could understand them because I would start reading them already feeling that I would not understand. I had this in mind that I could not understand the classicals because the language is different, the narrative style is different, but in the end, all was okay.
I think this way of thinking, it's much related to our experiences at school. As you said, we always thought that the classics in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese, they are not attractive to teenagers. And I guess that we have this feeling of we will not be able to read it because we will not understand at all because of the language that is old. Like Machado de Assis, right?
Yeah,
He has some words that are not used anymore in Brazil in current Brazilian Portuguese. And I will not lie to you. I felt that same way when I was a teenager. I think that's why I was so much attracted to YA books, you know, YA stories.
uh-huh. You know what? You mentioned Machado de Assis. My father says that if you want to read Machado de Assis, you have to read it, together with the dictionary.
He's not wrong.
Because, when you read such kind of works, you get out of your comfort zone. So, as from what I can see, I think it also applies to you. Our, period in reading during our major is marked by this, getting out of the comfort zone.
Yeah, then I mean I think we can classify this phase as a daring phase, you know, because
Okay, yeah.
even though that we had to read some books against our will, but we learned a lot about new things. I could never imagine I would read Shakespeare in the original language, you know, the Middle English, and I could, and it was not that hard at the beginning, maybe,
Yeah,
but
I'm
then
so
was not.
proud of myself because of that.
And I think also that for me at least, this daring phase, this phase that we got out of our comfort zone made me challenge myself sometimes. As I said about the Pride and Prejudice situation, I did the same with other book that I was so afraid of reading it, but at the same time I was so anxious to know the story. That was Gone with the Wind. I proposed to myself the challenge of reading the book in English for the first time. And I almost spent like a year reading it because of course the number of pages, but I was so proud of myself at the end and I was like this is the biggest book I've ever read. It
How
ha-
long is it?
it's like 1064 pages, I guess.
Jeez.
And it's not that hard a language because Margaret Mitchell wrote that book in the mid 30s. So the language is not old. It's just
Yeah, it
because it's
isn't.
long. I think until today, I can say that the especially the daring phase brought me so much um, uh, new experiences to me, literary experiences, and I'm so grateful for passing through these situations because I think they shaped actually my character, you know, which is the theme of the episode.
Yeah,
Um, I don't know. I think I am that kind of reader that likes when a story is about what comes through the character's mind, why he does this, why he does that, and it's like train of thought kind of reading, you know, like Virginia
yeah,
Woolf.
yeah. I do. I'm not really much into it, but it's very. It is interesting. It is.
And another thing that I think helped me shaping my character was it was only at the university during my major that I really got to know minorities literature, you know,
Uh
like
huh.
African American literature, immigrants literature, LGBT literature, and I'm very grateful for my professor to work with this kind of stories that are not so common and especially are not so translated to other languages.
True. I had I had the same experience since you mentioned, these minorities lit. I studied the subject of post-colonial lit, and we read lots of books, not lots of books, but some works from Nigerian authors. And I think two books that really, really weighed on me were Americana by Shimamanda Adichie and Things Fall Apart. I forgot now the name of the author, but yeah, these works, they made me open my eyes like a lot to see how things work. For African people, black people in this sense, because when you have contact with this type of lit, it somehow expands your view.
Do you think that this expand our view can be also related to um, the raise of awareness of us as citizens, as a society, as some people who acknowledge our privileges, our rights, our injustice, you know?
Yeah, I think it does, especially because when such authors in these minorities groups, they put narratives that deal with situations that they also have been through.
Yes,
Privileged people that people that are in a privileged position in society, when they read such works, they can look at themselves and acknowledge this. As you said, I'm privileged. When
yes,
I look at this narrative, at this story, at what at what all the situations that these people are constantly going through, and I am not.
yes. Especially those ones, for example, about LGBT lit that talks about a time that it's not today anymore, like the
Yeah,
80s, the
uh-huh.
70s. And you can feel like the changes of time.
You know what, Anna? I think that this that we are discussing, it applies to to a concept that a Brazilian literary critic created. His name is Antonio Cândido. He coined a concept of humanization through lit, and one thing that he mentions in this concept is related to how we treat, how we see, how we behave towards other people, and how lit can help us do it in the
I
sense that we became more humane.
I totally agree with that. And I think the most recent um, author that made me feel this was the Canadian poet Rupi.
Mm-hmm.
She has, I think it's because of my position as a woman in this society, and she focused most of her poems about this, about being a woman, about embracing our ancestors and our sisterhood and valuing ourselves and those kind of things that today for me is like what I'm focusing it mostly is to know myself more as a woman, which in this case is my position in society, a woman, and things that people have fought for all of these years. And I'm here today.
You see, I think that this kind of literature that you are mentioning, like now with your experience reading Rupi, I think that it is the kind of lit that I usually call provoking lit. Because it makes you think about who you are, what position you stand for in our society, and how the work and how the literary work makes you see that. It provokes you somehow. And
Yes,
that's what I think it's nice.
yes, agreed. Totally agree. How do you see yourself today after all these experiences, lit experiences of these phases?
It is it's quite difficult to answer because it is somehow very complex, but I see that nowadays I read, you know, books much more attentively, to details that I wouldn't pay attention in the past. And I'd also say that today I am much more, uh, let me see, I'm much more able to deconstruct myself after each literary work that I read.
What do you mean by that?
Because sometimes you read some books that makes you question, you know, morals, makes you question values, uh, uh, makes you think about them, and yeah, I say that in this sense, uh, you start to compare yourself with the characters, with the the author, and how all of this questioning that sometimes come to mind, depending on the literary work that you read, uh, makes you see how literature teaches with life, in the sense that uh, life is somehow represented on the literary works, and you can identify or not in some aspects or not with with the works. Your life and the works, you can identify them sometimes. So it makes me deconstruct myself a lot because of this. Because I see the way I behave in my real life the things that I have built that were taught me, and how I can teach more from the works. How can I see new behaviors, and how can I see uh, problems, social problems that are pictured in the books. So all of this makes me think of how I can deconstruct and construct myself. It's a continuum, it's a process. Every work that I read, I deconstruct and I construct something in my personality, in my personality basically. I think this is how I feel it nowadays. It may change in the future, but nowadays I think that's the way it is. And you?
I think it also makes you discover new things about you sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Not only construct, as you said, but also discover. I totally understand what you say, and I totally relate to it also because you know movies, when you watch a movie and you think like, oh my god, I'm just like this character, my life is just like this. You
Yeah.
relate almost immediately with that character. And I think with books it's almost the same. I mean, you read a story and you think, oh my god, I'm like this character. I would my life end like this? And you start analyzing yourself and your actions. And yeah, I think it's all about building self-criticism.
And you know what I like to do? When I read, depending on the story, somehow you will identify or not to some characters, and I like to make this reflection. Why do I identify to this character and not to this one?
Yes, perfect.
You know, it's the kind of question that I like to ask myself, because sometimes you identify with a character because he or she looks so much like you, or not. But I keep thinking about this. What are the reasons that make me identify or not with a character? As you said, it may such question can help me discover things about myself.
Yes. It's all about building self-conscious, self-criticism, self-knowledge, and I think literature, among many other things in life, it's one of the most that helps you with that, to build these things.
I would just say, again, the idea of Antonio Cândido, the literary critic that I mentioned, that he says this, that literature teaches with life, not because it is moralizing, because any a literary work cannot be seen as moral or immoral, but it teaches with life because it brings into it uh, everything, the good and the bad,
Yes.
and you can learn, or not necessarily learn, but you can reflect upon that.
Yes, and also because of this morality idea, it's such a black and white ideology,
Yeah, it's true.
the right and the wrong. But what I really appreciate is the complexity of the human being. And when that is reflected in a work, I I feel like very delighted because I that's the thing that I mostly relate with. It's the complexity. Not every time is the character or the situation, but the complexity, the train of thought that that character has, or the narrator has with those characters. You see?
You made me think now about something that when I read, sometimes uh, the books make me think and make me observe uh, this complexity, of mind, this complexity within society, complexities in general. I like to observe them in the books, and from the books, I can see them in real life. I don't know if you know what I mean, but
Yes.
sometimes we are so blinded that we cannot see some of these complexities in other people, also in ourselves, but also within the people that we live among. And when we read, sometimes the readings that we do, they do open our eyes, to see the reality around us.
Yeah, that's what I think about complex stories and complex characters too. Because we are like this. Those stories, it's like those stories, they are reality, and the fantasy are unreal. It's the opposite of what we want to believe. We want to believe that the fantasy can be real sometimes, and that this complexity is the bad view of life that we want to avoid because we don't want to think, we don't want to analyze things, so we invert the things. And I think this aspect is well represented in the absurd movement in the mid of last century. As you
I was
know,
just thinking about it.
yeah, you remember we studied at the complexity, and it's so frightening at the same time. And I think I like that frightening feeling of facing reality, facing how we can be self-destructive sometimes as human beings, and how that how some actions that we think are glorified for human beings actually they kind of are not.
Yeah, absurdity is amongst us, and sometimes we don't notice, or sometimes we don't get the grasp of it until we read something of the genre,
Yes.
and we can start to see things differently. I
Yes.
think that, as you mentioned, also for me, this absurd movement that we studied in drama, uh, it made me see uh, much more clearly what we understand by complexity in the real world.
Yes. And how necessary it's for us to see it. And seeing it, for me, it's embracing the self-criticism and the self-awareness that we sometimes we just don't have it. We don't know if we exist sometimes, especially because of the lack of self-awareness. We don't know who we are.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd say that that's the importance of opening yourself to trying out new genres. Even though you always have your preferences. I have my preferences. You have yours. But when when you try out new genres, new narratives, new ways, new styles of reading, you get more self-aware. I'd say that about you, about people, about real world, and all that stuff. Because uh, I know that okay, even though we have our preferences, if we only, if we stick only to that during our whole life, if we only read the same thing, the same genre, the same author, the same kind of lit, we will, okay, I'd say we will not expand nothing or almost nothing on our views.
Like we would not grow,
Yeah,
right? Yes.
because you see that everything that we discussed and how lit shapes our character. If you stop to pay attention, uh, we've been discussing different or citing and mentioning different genres, and all of those shaped our character, not only one.
They shaped and they are shaping.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process. It's a non-stopping process, right? Well, guys, this was our first episode called How Can Literature Shape Our Character? We hope you like it.
So if you liked it, please share with your friends, and don't forget to follow us on Instagram at lit.podcast.
And leave a comment on our post about this episode.
See you all on our next episode on Literary Tea Podcast.